Captain Sarah Chen walked through the bustling corridors of the space station with her maintenance toolkit, her coveralls stained with engine grease, and her hair tied back in a simple ponytail. To everyone around her, she was just another technician keeping the massive orbital facility running smoothly. The other workers barely glanced her way as she checked fuel lines and calibrated atmospheric processors. What they didn't know was that Sarah had logged over 3,000 flight hours in military fighters before taking this civilian job. She had graduated top of her class from the prestigious Titan Naval Academy, where she'd earned her wings flying the most advanced combat aircraft humanity had ever built. Her service record included missions that were still classified, operations that had helped secure humanity's expansion into the outer colonies. But Sarah had left all that behind 3 years ago. The constant warfare, the loss of friends, and the weight of command had taken their toll. She'd requested a transfer to civilian service, wanting nothing more than to work with her hands and forget about the cockpit. The space station job was perfect, quiet, routine, and far from any conflict zones. Sarah's reputation as a pilot was known only to the station commander, who had promised to keep her secret. To everyone else, she was simply Sarah from engineering, the woman who could fix any machine and always volunteered for the toughest repair jobs. She liked it that way. The other technicians respected her skills with machinery, and she'd built genuine friendships without the baggage of her military past. During her lunch breaks, Sarah would sometimes stand at the observation deck, watching the sleek fighter patrols practice their formations in the distance. Her hands would unconsciously mimic the control movements, muscle memory still sharp despite years away from the pilot's seat. But she always walked away before anyone noticed her intense focus on the aircraft. The station housed nearly 10,000 civilian workers and their families, along with a modest defense force of 40 fighters. Most of the military personnel were young pilots fresh from training, eager for action but lacking real combat experience. Sarah often overheard their conversations in the corridors, their bravado and excitement reminding her of herself at that age. Sometimes the younger pilots would ask her technical questions about their fighters when she was doing maintenance work. Sarah would give helpful answers about engine performance and weapon systems, careful to frame her knowledge as purely technical rather than operational. They assumed she'd learned everything from repair manuals and engineering courses. The irony wasn't lost on her that she knew more about combat flying than any pilot on the station, yet she spent her days crawling through maintenance shafts and replacing worn components. But Sarah had found peace in this new life. She enjoyed the satisfaction of solving mechanical puzzles and the camaraderie of her work crew. Her small quarters were spartanly furnished, with no mementos from her military service visible. She'd packed away her medals, commendations, and the photos of her old squadron. The only hint of her past was a small model of a Viper-class fighter tucked away in a drawer, a gift from her former wingman before he died in the Battle of Proxima Station. Sarah's daily routine was comforting in its predictability. She'd wake at 600, grab coffee from the mess hall, and report to engineering for her assignments. Today was no different as she reviewed the maintenance schedule on her tablet. 3 fighters needed routine inspections. The atmospheric recycling system in Section C needed calibration, and there were reports of power fluctuations in the weapons control center. As she headed toward the fighter bay for the first inspection, Sarah passed a group of young pilots discussing their training exercises. One of them, Lieutenant Torres, was complaining about his gunnery scores. Sarah paused, pretending to check something on her tablet while listening to their conversation about targeting systems and fire control. She could have told them exactly how to improve their accuracy, shared techniques that had made her one of the deadliest pilots in the fleet, but instead she simply continued walking, leaving them to figure it out on their own. Sarah had chosen this quiet life, and she was determined to keep her past buried. The alarm began as a distant wail that gradually grew louder throughout the station. Sarah looked up from the fighter's engine compartment where she'd been replacing a faulty power coupling, her trained ears immediately recognizing the specific pattern of tones. Long-range sensors had detected something approaching, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Emergency lights bathed the fighter bay in red as personnel scrambled to their positions. Sarah watched the chaos with practiced eyes, noting how the young pilots rushed to their aircraft with a mixture of excitement and nervous energy. Most of them had never seen real combat despite months of training simulations. "All maintenance personnel clear the bay immediately," came the announcement over the intercom. "This is not a drill. All civilian staff report to emergency stations. Sarah gathered her tools slowly in no hurry to leave. She'd been through dozens of these alerts during her military service, and experience had taught her that the first few minutes were usually confusion and preparation rather than immediate action. Through the bay's massive viewing windows, she could see the running lights of patrol fighters returning to the station at maximum speed. Lieutenant Torres ran past her toward his fighter, his face pale with adrenaline. "Sarah, you need to get out of here." "Unknown contacts approaching fast, looks like raiders." She nodded calmly and headed toward the exit, but stopped when she heard the communications officer's voice echoing through the bay speakers. "Incoming vessels confirmed hostile. 12 fighter-class ships, unknown configuration. ETA 6 minutes. All pilots to ready stations." 12 fighters against the station's 40 defenders should have been manageable odds, but Sarah knew better. The attacking force wouldn't reveal their full strength until the last moment, and raiders usually had experienced pilots flying modified ships with illegal weapons. The station's young defenders were about to face their first real battle. As Sarah reached the corridor outside the fighter bay, she passed Commander Walsh rushing in the opposite direction. He barely glanced at her, his mind clearly focused on the approaching threat. She'd worked under Walsh for 3 years, and while he was a competent administrator, he had limited combat experience himself. The civilian evacuation was proceeding smoothly, with families moving toward the heavily shielded core sections of the station. Sarah followed the crowd but found herself walking slower and slower as her military instincts kicked in. Every fiber of her being wanted to know more about the tactical situation. She ducked into a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the command center, accessing a diagnostic terminal that could tap into the station's sensor network. Her engineering clearance gave her access to most systems, including the tactical displays that were currently tracking the incoming raiders. What she saw made her blood run cold. The 12 contacts were just the advance force. Her experienced eye could read the sensor returns well enough to spot the subtle distortions that indicated cloaked ships following behind them. This wasn't a random raid. It was a coordinated attack by a much larger force. Sarah's hands moved across the terminal controls with practiced efficiency, pulling up ship recognition databases and tactical analyses. The attacking fighters were modified Kestrel-class ships, fast and heavily armed. More concerning were the larger contacts she was detecting. At least 2 cruiser-sized vessels hanging back in the sensor shadows. The station's fighters were launching now, their engines creating brilliant streaks of light as they accelerated away from the docking bays. Sarah counted 38 craft total. 2 fighters must have been down for major repairs. Against what appeared to be a force 3 times that size, the odds were grim. She should have been moving toward the evacuation centers like every other civilian. Instead, Sarah found herself heading deeper into the station's service areas, toward a maintenance shaft that would take her to the auxiliary fighter bay. Her rational mind told her to follow orders and seek shelter, but 20 years of military training was overriding civilian caution. The auxiliary bay housed the station's reserve fighters, older models kept for emergencies and training purposes. As Sarah emerged from the maintenance shaft, she was surprised to find the bay completely empty. Everyone had been so focused on launching the primary squadrons that they'd forgotten about the reserves. 3 fighters sat on their launch rails, their systems powered down but fully fueled and armed. Sarah approached the nearest one, a Mark 7 Viper that was at least 10 years old but had been meticulously maintained. She ran her hand along its hull, feeling the familiar texture of composite armor plating. Through the bay's viewing ports, she could see the first exchange of fire in the distance. Bright flashes of weapons fire lit up the darkness of space as the station's defenders engaged the raider advance force. Even from this distance, Sarah could tell the battle wasn't going well. The station's pilots were flying predictably, using textbook formations that experienced raiders would easily exploit. Her communicator crackled with fragments of radio chatter from the battle. Pilots calling for assistance, tactical updates from the command center, and the controlled chaos of aerial combat filled the channel. Sarah recognized the stress in their voices. These young pilots were quickly learning the difference between simulation and reality. A massive explosion bloomed in the distance, and Sarah's heart sank as she realized one of the station's fighters had been destroyed. The raiders were using the classic strategy of overwhelming single targets with concentrated fire, picking off the defenders one by one while staying mobile enough to avoid retaliation. Sarah stood in the empty bay, torn between her desire for a quiet life and her knowledge that she was probably the only person on the station capable of turning the tide of this battle. The choice would define not just her future, but potentially the lives of everyone aboard the station. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the fighter's hull, 3 years of suppressed instincts warring with her conscious decision to leave combat behind. The radio chatter from the battle grew more desperate by the minute, with pilots calling out casualties and requesting immediate reinforcement. Another explosion lit up the viewports, and she knew they'd lost a second fighter. The Mark 7 Viper in front of her was older than the current models, but Sarah knew its capabilities intimately. She'd flown hundreds of missions in similar craft during the colonial wars, and this particular fighter had been upgraded with newer targeting systems and improved shielding. Her engineering work had kept it in perfect condition. Station command to all reserve units came a desperate voice over the comm system. Any available pilots report to Auxiliary Bay immediately. Repeat, we need all reserve fighters launched now. But there were no reserve pilots. The station's entire complement was already in space, fighting a losing battle against superior numbers and experience. Sarah watched through the viewport as the defensive formation began to collapse, individual fighters breaking away to avoid being surrounded and picked off. She climbed into the fighter's cockpit, telling herself she was just checking the systems to make sure they were ready for whoever might eventually fly them. The familiar embrace of the pilot's seat triggered muscle memory that had been dormant for years. Her hands automatically found the primary controls while her feet settled on the rudder pedals. The startup sequence came back to her effortlessly. Power systems online, navigation active, weapon systems armed and ready. The fighter's engines hummed to life with a sound that sent shivers down her spine. A sound she'd thought she'd never hear again from inside a cockpit. Through the tactical display, Sarah could see the true scope of the battle. The raiders had sprung their trap perfectly, with the cloaked ships now decloaking behind the station's defensive line. The station's fighters were caught between two forces, exactly as the enemy had planned. It was a classic pincer movement that would result in total destruction of the defending force. Sarah's training took over as she analyzed the tactical situation with the cold precision that had made her one of the fleet's most effective pilots. The raiders were using a modified Kestrel formation, with their most experienced pilots in the lead elements and newer fighters providing support fire. They were good, but they were fighting like pirates, focused on individual kills rather than coordinated objectives. The station's young pilots were brave but inexperienced, flying with textbook precision that made them predictable. They needed someone to take command of the battle, someone who could think like the enemy and turn their own tactics against them. Sarah realized she was the only person in position to do exactly that. Her finger hovered over the launch sequence controls. Once she activated them, there would be no going back. Her carefully constructed civilian life would be over, replaced by the chaos and violence she'd worked so hard to escape. But the alternative was watching everyone on the station die while she hid in safety. The decision crystallized when she heard Lieutenant Torres' voice crack over the radio as he called for emergency assistance. His fighter had taken damage and he was struggling to maintain control while two raiders closed in for the kill. Sarah had watched him grow from an overconfident rookie into a competent pilot over the past year, and she wasn't going to let him die. Launch sequence initiated, she said quietly to herself, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. The fighter's systems completed their final checks as the launch rail powered up beneath her. Magnetic clamps released and the catapult system engaged, hurling her fighter out of the bay at tremendous acceleration. Space opened up around her as Sarah emerged from the station's protective hull. The battle was spread across several thousand cubic kilometers, with individual dogfights scattered throughout the volume. Her tactical display immediately identified 26 friendly contacts and 43 hostiles, worse odds than she'd initially calculated. Sarah banked hard to port, using the station's superstructure to mask her approach while she studied the enemy formations. The raiders were good, but she'd faced better during the Titan campaign. More importantly, they wouldn't be expecting a new fighter to enter the battle with the tactical awareness of a veteran pilot. Her first priority was rescuing Torres, whose fighter was limping toward the station with two raiders in pursuit. Sarah angled her approach to come up behind the attackers, using a sensor shadow cast by the station's communication array to remain undetected until the last possible moment. The lead raider was focused entirely on Torres, lining up for a killing shot with methodical precision. Sarah waited until she was within optimal range before announcing her presence with a burst of cannon fire that tore through the raider's port wing and sent it spinning out of control. The second raider reacted instantly, breaking off his attack on Torres to engage this new threat. Sarah smiled grimly as she recognized the pilot's skill level. Definitely experienced, but not quite good enough. She pulled into a spiraling climb that forced the raider to follow, setting up the energy advantage she'd need for what came next. The real battle was just beginning, and for the first time in 3 years, Captain Sarah Chen was back in her element. The raider pilot was skilled, but Sarah had been fighting experienced opponents since before he'd learned to fly. She let him think he was gaining the advantage, allowing her fighter to drift slightly out of optimal position while secretly calculating vectors and timing. The moment he committed to his attack run, she rolled inverted and dove beneath his line of fire. Her return shot was surgical in its precision, targeting the raider's engine mounting points rather than attempting to destroy the entire craft. The enemy fighter's power plant erupted in a controlled explosion that left the pilot alive but completely disabled. Sarah had always preferred to disable rather than destroy when possible, a philosophy that had earned her respect even among enemy forces. "Unknown fighter, identify yourself immediately," came Commander Walsh's voice over the tactical channel. "You are not cleared for combat operations." Sarah ignored the communication for now, her attention focused on the larger tactical picture. The station's defensive formation was collapsing faster than she'd anticipated, with several fighters already destroyed and others taking heavy damage. The raiders were systematically exploiting every weakness in the defenders' positioning. She banked sharply toward the main engagement zone, where 8 station fighters were trying to hold off nearly 20 raiders in a swirling dogfight that was slowly moving away from the station. The young pilots were fighting bravely but individually, each one focused on personal survival rather than coordinated tactics. Sarah activated the emergency command frequency and transmitted on all channels simultaneously. "All station fighters, this is emergency tactical command. Cease individual engagements and form up on my position immediately. Execute Delta Formation 7 on my mark." The response was immediate confusion as pilots tried to figure out who was giving orders. Delta Formation 7 was an advanced combat maneuver that most of them had only practiced in simulation, but Sarah knew it was their only chance against the superior numbers they faced. "Who is this?" Lieutenant Torres's voice came through clearly, his fighter now safely behind the defensive line thanks to Sarah's intervention. "Command, we have an unidentified fighter giving tactical orders." Sarah didn't have time for explanations. She accelerated toward the center of the main engagement, her fighter's weapon systems tracking multiple targets simultaneously. The raiders had committed to a classic envelopment maneuver, spreading their forces thin to surround the station's defenders. It was exactly the opening she'd been waiting for. "All fighters, break by pairs and execute rolling scissors on my mark," she commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded squadrons in real combat. "Focus fire on the lead elements only. Ignore the flanking forces until I give the word." Some of the station pilots began to respond instinctively to her commands, their training recognizing the voice of experienced authority, even if they didn't know who was giving the orders. Sarah smiled grimly as she watched 3 pairs of fighters begin to execute the maneuver properly. Her own target was the raider formation leader, a heavily modified Kestrel that was directing the enemy attack from a position of relative safety. Taking out the command element would disrupt their coordination and buy the station fighters precious time to reorganize. The approach required threading between 2 other dogfights while avoiding the crossfire from at least 6 different weapon systems. Sarah's hands moved across the controls with the fluid grace of someone who had performed similar maneuvers hundreds of times, her fighter dancing through the chaos like it was choreographed. The raider commander was good enough to spot her approach and began evasive maneuvers that would have defeated most pilots. But Sarah had faced similar opponents during the siege of New Shanghai, where she'd earned her reputation as one of the fleet's most dangerous combat pilots. She used the classic feint that had become her signature move, appearing to commit to a high-speed attack run before suddenly cutting power and dropping below the enemy's flight path. The raider commander's return fire passed harmlessly overhead, while Sarah's weapons locked onto his engine assembly. The shot was perfect, her cannon rounds punching through the Raiders' rear shielding and detonating the main power core. The explosion was visible throughout the battle area, and Sarah felt a familiar mixture of satisfaction and regret as she watched another enemy fighter die. But her victory had an unexpected effect on the battle. The remaining Raiders, seeing their commander destroyed by what appeared to be a random station fighter, began to fight more cautiously. They pulled back from their aggressive pursuit, trying to understand what had changed in the tactical situation. More importantly, the station's fighters began to rally around her position. They might not know who she was, but they recognized competent leadership when they saw it. For the first time since the battle began, the defenders were acting as a coordinated unit, rather than a collection of individual fighters. "This is Commander Walsh to unknown fighter," came the transmission again. "You will identify yourself immediately or be considered hostile. Your unauthorized participation in this battle is a violation of military protocol." Sarah almost laughed at the irony of being threatened with military discipline while actively saving the lives of everyone on the station. Instead, she focused on the tactical display, where new contacts were appearing at the edge of sensor range. The Raiders had brought reinforcements and the real battle was just beginning. "All station fighters prepare for second wave engagement," she transmitted calmly. "Enemy reinforcements approaching from bearing 270. We're going to show them how real pilots fight." The second wave of Raiders emerged from behind a nearby asteroid, their formation tight and professional. Sarah's experienced eye immediately recognized the difference. These weren't opportunistic pirates like the first group. These were military-trained pilots flying in perfect coordination, possibly former fleet personnel who had turned mercenary. "Station fighters, execute gamma dispersal pattern immediately," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through the radio chatter with calm authority. "Do not engage the new contacts directly. I repeat, avoid direct engagement until further orders." She watched with approval as most of the surviving station fighters began to spread out, according to her instructions. The young pilots might be confused about who was giving orders, but they were smart enough to follow commands that were keeping them alive. The new Raider formation numbered 16 fighters, bringing the total enemy force to nearly 30 active units against the station's remaining 22 defenders. But numbers weren't everything in space combat. Positioning, timing, and experience could overcome raw numerical superiority. Sarah's tactical display showed her exactly what she needed. The two Raider groups were operating independently, with the newcomers maintaining formation discipline while the surviving pirates from the first wave were scattered and demoralized. She could use that separation against them. "Torres, take your wingman and draw the port flank Raiders toward grid 77 Alpha, she transmitted. "Keep them engaged, but do not close to weapons range. You're the bait for a larger trap." Lieutenant Torres responded immediately, his fighter banking toward the designated coordinates with his wingman following close behind. The young pilot had learned to trust the mysterious voice that had already saved his life once during this battle. Sarah accelerated toward the main Raider formation, but instead of attacking directly, she positioned herself between them and the scattered remnants of the first wave. Her plan required precise timing and a level of risk that would have been considered reckless by conventional standards. The lead Raider in the new formation was clearly an experienced pilot, maintaining perfect positioning while directing his squadron with crisp radio commands. Sarah recognized the tactical patterns from her own military training. These pilots had definitely served in a regular fleet before turning mercenary. She waited until the two Raider groups were at maximum separation before making her move. Banking hard to starboard, she accelerated directly toward the scattered first wave, while transmitting on a frequency she knew the new Raiders would be monitoring. "Station command to all fighters. Execute Plan 7 immediately," she broadcast, using military terminology that would mean nothing to her own pilots, but would sound ominous to enemy forces listening in. "Repeat, Plan 7 is now in effect. All units converge on designated targets." The effect was immediate. The professional Raiders, hearing what sounded like the activation of a predetermined battle plan, began to tighten their formation defensively. They were too disciplined to panic, but uncertainty crept into their movements as they tried to figure out what Plan 7 might entail. Meanwhile, Sarah dove into the scattered first wave like a hawk among sparrows. Her weapon systems tracked multiple targets simultaneously, and she began a methodical destruction sequence that eliminated 3 Raiders in less than 90 seconds. Each shot was perfectly placed to disable or destroy, with no wasted ammunition. The remaining pirates from the first wave broke and ran, their morale completely shattered by the appearance of what seemed to be an elite pilot among the station's defenders. Sarah let them go. Demoralized enemies often spread more fear than destroyed ones. "All station fighters converge on my position," she commanded. "We're going to hit the main formation before they can reorganize. Stay in pairs and follow my lead." The professional raiders were still trying to figure out what was happening when Sarah led the station's remaining fighters in a coordinated assault on their formation. But instead of the frontal attack they were expecting, she had positioned her forces for a complex spiral maneuver that would bring them through the enemy formation at multiple angles. The raid leader was skilled enough to recognize the danger and began barking orders for his squadron to break formation and engage individually. But Sarah had anticipated this response, and she had already positioned her fighters to exploit the chaos that would result from their formation breaking up. "Now," she transmitted, rolling inverted and diving through the center of the raider formation with cannon blazing. Her perfectly timed attack struck the raid leader's fighter just as he was trying to coordinate his squadron's response, sending his craft spiraling out of control with its port wing completely destroyed. The station fighters followed her through the gap she'd created, their weapons finding targets among the confused raiders. In the span of 5 minutes, the battle shifted from a desperate defense to a rout, as the remaining raiders found themselves outmaneuvered and outgunned by pilots they had initially dismissed as amateurs. "Station fighters, cease pursuit and return to defensive positions," Sarah ordered as the surviving raiders began to withdraw toward the edge of the system. "Let them go. Our job is to protect the station, not hunt down stragglers." For the first time in over an hour, the space around the station was clear of immediate threats. The surviving raiders were running for hyperspace, their attack completely broken by the intervention of a single mysterious pilot who had turned the tide of the entire battle. Sarah's fighter drifted quietly among the defensive formation, her weapons powered down and her systems running on minimal power. Around her, the station's pilots were celebrating their victory and trying to figure out who their mysterious savior had been. But Sarah was already thinking about the consequences of what she'd just done and wondering if her quiet life was truly over forever. The aftermath of battle brought an eerie quiet to the space around the station. Emergency recovery teams launched to collect debris and search for survivors, while the remaining fighters formed a protective patrol pattern. Sarah hung back from the main formation, hoping to slip away unnoticed and return her fighter to the auxiliary bay before anyone realized what had happened. But her plan fell apart when Commander Walsh's voice crackled over the command frequency with unmistakable authority. "Unknown pilot in the Mark 7 Viper, you are ordered to return to the main hangar bay immediately for debriefing. Do not attempt to land anywhere else. Security teams are standing by." Sarah sighed, knowing her secret was about to be exposed. She'd saved the station and everyone aboard it, but military protocol demanded answers that she wasn't sure she was ready to give. Her 3 years of peaceful anonymity were about to end in spectacular fashion. The flight back to the main hangar took only a few minutes, but Sarah used the time to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. She'd face questions about her identity, her training, and why a civilian maintenance worker had access to military-grade combat skills. The truth would inevitably come out. As her fighter settled onto the landing platform, Sarah could see that word of the mysterious pilot had spread throughout the station. Maintenance crews, off-duty personnel, and even some of the civilian families had gathered in the observation areas overlooking the hangar bay. Everyone wanted to see the person who had single-handedly saved them all. The canopy hissed open and Sarah climbed out slowly, her coverall still stained with the morning's maintenance work. The watching crowd fell silent as they recognized the familiar figure of the quiet engineer who had worked among them for 3 years. Whispers began to ripple through the assembled spectators. Commander Walsh approached with a security escort, his expression a mixture of confusion, anger, and grudging respect. Behind him walked several of the surviving pilots, including Lieutenant Torres, whose life Sarah had saved in the opening moments of the battle. "Sarah Chen from engineering," Walsh said, his voice carrying clearly across the hangar. "Would you care to explain how a civilian maintenance worker just demonstrated the combat skills of an elite military pilot?" Sarah straightened to attention out of habit, her military bearing suddenly obvious to everyone present. I was helping with the defense of the station, sir. The situation required immediate action. That's not an answer, Walsh replied firmly. I want to know your real background, your training history, and how you gained access to classified tactical procedures that only senior combat pilots should know. Before Sarah could respond, Lieutenant Torres stepped forward. Commander, with respect, does it really matter right now? This woman just saved all of our lives. She took down 6 enemy fighters personally and coordinated our entire defensive response. Without her intervention, we'd all be dead. Other voices joined in from the gathered crowd. Maintenance workers who had known Sarah for years spoke up about her character and dedication. Civilians whose children played with her in the common areas defended her actions. Even some of the younger pilots added their support, describing how her tactical commands had turned certain defeat into victory. Walsh raised his hand for silence, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. I appreciate the sentiment, but unauthorized military action is still a serious breach of protocol. I need answers, and I need them now. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. My name is Captain Sarah Chen, formerly of the 15th Fighter Wing, service number 7749 Delta Alpha. I resigned my commission 3 years ago and requested assignment to civilian duties. The revelation sent a wave of shock through the assembled crowd. Captain Chen was a name that carried significant weight in military circles. Her service record included some of the most successful fighter operations in recent colonial history. You're Captain Sarah Chen? One of the younger pilots gasped. The Sarah Chen who led the defense of New Shanghai, the pilot who single-handedly broke the siege of Proxima Station? Sarah nodded reluctantly. Among other things, yes. I've been working in your engineering section for 3 years, trying to live a quiet life away from combat. Today's attack forced me to make a choice between maintaining my cover and letting everyone on this station die. Commander Walsh's expression softened slightly as the full implications hit him. He was looking at one of the most decorated fighter pilots in the fleet, someone whose tactical expertise exceeded his own by several orders of magnitude. The unauthorized action suddenly looked more like divine intervention than insubordination. Why didn't you tell us? Torres asked, speaking for many of the gathered personnel. We could have learned so much from you. The training, the tactical knowledge. You could have been teaching us instead of fixing our engines. Sarah's response was quiet but carried clearly across the hangar. Because I've seen too much death, Lieutenant. I've lost too many friends and made too many hard decisions. I came here to find peace, not to train the next generation of warriors. I thought I was done with fighting. The silence that followed was broken by slow rhythmic clapping from someone in the crowd. Others joined in until the entire hangar echoed with applause. These people understood that Sarah had sacrificed her peaceful anonymity to save their lives, revealing a secret she had guarded carefully for 3 years. Commander Walsh finally spoke, his voice formal but respectful. Captain Chen, given the circumstances and the lives saved by your actions today, I'm prepared to overlook the protocol violations. However, I think we need to discuss your future status on this station. The fleet could use someone with your skills and experience. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she had worked alongside, shared meals with, and grown to care about during her time in exile. They were looking at her differently now, seeing the warrior instead of the engineer, and she wondered if things could ever go back to the way they were before. 3 weeks after the battle, Sarah sat in her usual spot in the observation lounge, watching the new patrol formations practice their maneuvers in the distance. The movements were noticeably different now, more coordinated, more professional, incorporating the tactical lessons she'd shared during the intensive training sessions that had followed her revelation. The offer from Fleet Command had arrived within days of the battle. A full reinstatement of her military rank, command of the station's expanded fighter wing, and assignment to a new deep space defense initiative. It was everything her younger self would have dreamed of. Responsibility, respect, and the chance to make a real difference in the ongoing conflicts that plagued the outer colonies. She'd turned it down. Instead, Sarah had negotiated a unique compromise that satisfied everyone's needs. She remained a civilian employee of the station, keeping her engineering position and the quiet life she'd grown to love. But twice a week she conducted advanced tactical training for the fighter pilots, sharing 20 years of combat experience with the next generation of defenders. The arrangement worked better than anyone had expected. The young pilots learned from one of the fleet's most experienced combat veterans, while Sarah was able to contribute to their safety without returning to active military service. She could see the improvement in their skills with each training session. Lieutenant Torres approached her table, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the confident expression of someone whose skills had dramatically improved. "Mind if I join you, Captain? I know you prefer just Sarah, but old habits die hard." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully.
How did the advanced formation practice go today?
"I saw some impressive coordination from up here. Much better than before you started training us," Torres replied. "We're actually thinking like a squadron now instead of just a collection of individual pilots. The difference is incredible when you see it from the inside." Through the viewport, they watched as a new group of fighters launched for their patrol shift. The launch sequence was smoother now, with each pilot knowing their exact role in the formation before they even left the hangar. Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction watching the improved professionalism. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Torres continued. "Do you ever regret giving up your military career? I mean, you were one of the best pilots in the fleet, and now you're fixing engines and teaching rookies basic tactics." Sarah considered the question while sipping her coffee. "I thought I regretted it for a long time. Combat was all I knew and I was good at it. But these past 3 years taught me that there are different ways to serve, different ways to make a difference. I'm happier now than I was as a military officer, even after having to fight again during the raid." "Especially after that," Sarah replied. "Because this time, I fought to protect a home I'd built rather than following orders from people who'd never seen combat. I fought for people I cared about, in a place where I belonged. That makes all the difference." The conversation was interrupted by an announcement over the station's communication system. "Captain Chen to the command center, please." Captain Chen to the command center. Sarah raised an eyebrow. She was rarely summoned to meetings anymore, having made it clear that her involvement would be limited to training and emergency situations. In the command center, Commander Walsh was studying a tactical display with obvious concern. When Sarah arrived, he gestured toward the screen where new contacts were appearing at the edge of the sensor grid. "We've got another situation developing," Walsh explained. "Long-range sensors are picking up what looks like a major pirate fleet moving through this sector. Intelligence suggests they might be planning coordinated attacks on multiple stations." Sarah studied the display with professional interest. The enemy formation was larger and better organized than the raiders they'd faced 3 weeks earlier. This wasn't a random attack. It was part of a larger campaign that could threaten civilian populations throughout the region. "What's Fleet Command's response time?" she asked. 48 hours minimum," Walsh replied. "We're on our own until the cavalry arrives. I hate to ask this, Sarah, but we need your tactical expertise. Not just for training this time, for active command coordination." Sarah looked at the tactical display for a long moment, weighing her options. She'd found peace on this station, built relationships and a life that mattered to her, but peace was only valuable if it could be protected when threatened. "I'll coordinate the defense," she said finally, "but I do it as a civilian consultant, not as a military officer. And when this is over, I go back to engineering and training duties. No heroic commissions, no return to active service." Walsh nodded agreement. "Whatever it takes to keep everyone safe." As Sarah began analyzing the enemy approach patterns and developing defensive strategies, she felt the familiar rush of tactical planning. But this time it was different. She wasn't fighting for abstract strategic objectives or following orders from distant commanders. She was protecting her home, her friends, and the life she'd built. The young pilots would face another test soon, but this time they'd be led by someone who understood that the best victories weren't measured in enemy ships destroyed, but in the people and places successfully defended. Sarah Chen had found her true calling, not as a warrior seeking glory, but as a guardian protecting what mattered most. Outside the command center viewports, the station's fighters began launching in perfect formation, their pilots confident and ready. They were no longer just defending a military installation, they were protecting their home, guided by someone who had learned that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in seeking battle, but in choosing when and how to fight.